Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest realities hidden beneath the glory of ancient Rome. Because while statues, emperors, and giant triumphal arches love to stand in history books looking confident, there was another Rome beneath all of that marble, a Rome that ordinary people experienced every single day. And it was a world of noise, smoke, strange smells, crowded streets, and routines that would feel completely unbelievable to most of us today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys through history. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now, because I always love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Settle into your blankets and let us drift slowly into tonight's journey together. Imagine arriving in Rome just before sunrise sometime around the 1st century. The city is still dark, but not quiet. Ancient Rome almost never became truly quiet. Even before dawn, there are footsteps echoing through narrow streets, merchants preparing stalls, bakers feeding wood into ovens, distant dogs barking somewhere between tightly packed buildings, and from hidden courtyards comes the sound of people already beginning work. Then the sky starts turning gray, and slowly the giant city wakes up. 1 million people living together creates its own weather, its own sound, almost its own heartbeat. Smoke begins climbing from rooftops as fires are lit for cooking. Market workers drag carts over stone roads. Somewhere nearby, a man shouts angrily because a donkey refuses to move. Somewhere else, another man shouts because the donkey moved directly into him. This is not the elegant Rome from paintings. This is daily Rome, the real Rome. And for ordinary people, surviving the city itself sometimes felt like a full-time occupation. The streets were narrow enough that 2 carts passing each other could become a complicated negotiation involving insults and hand gestures. Shopkeepers opened their wooden shutters toward the roads and immediately began competing with one another for customers. One sells bread, another sells oil, another sells fish. Another claims his wine is better than everyone else's wine, despite the fact that everyone nearby insists he has been watering it down for years. Voices rise from every direction until individual conversations disappear and blend into one giant wave of sound. And above all of this rises the apartment buildings where most Romans lived. Towering structures stacked floor upon floor over the crowded streets below. From a distance, they probably looked impressive. From underneath, they looked slightly concerning, because Roman apartment buildings had a habit of making residents nervous. Some leaned in ways buildings probably should not lean. Others creaked in the wind. Others had landlords who believed construction rules were merely interesting suggestions. Living on the upper floors meant climbing endless stairs every day, carrying water and supplies, because lower floors belonged to people with more money, while higher floors belonged to people with fewer choices. Imagine returning home after a long day of work and climbing 5 flights of narrow wooden stairs, carrying food and water, while hoping the floor beneath your feet remained committed to supporting human life. And once you finally reached your room, you probably discovered something disappointing: space, or more accurately, lack of space. Entire families sometimes lived inside rooms smaller than modern bedrooms. Furniture was limited. Privacy was rare. Noise traveled through walls so easily that you probably knew your neighbor's arguments better than your own family history. And then came nighttime. Because if you think Rome became calmer after sunset, Unfortunately, ancient Rome had other plans. As daylight faded, oil lamps flickered along streets while shadows stretched between buildings. Shops slowly closed. Wealthier citizens returned to safer districts. But the city itself continued moving. Taverns filled with voices. Dice games continued. Drunken singing echoed somewhere in the darkness. Groups of people gathered around food stalls, still selling bread and hot meals. Others moved quietly through alleys with less honest intentions. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps approach, and immediately your mind begins asking uncomfortable questions, because walking alone at night in Rome required confidence and occasionally very fast legs. Ancient writers constantly complained about nighttime dangers. Robbers hid in dark corners. Gangs wandered certain districts. Fights could appear suddenly and spread quickly. And then there were dangers from above because residents living in crowded apartments occasionally solved garbage problems by throwing things into the street below, which meant walking through. Rome after dark involved not only avoiding thieves, but also avoiding gravity, and whatever gravity happened to be carrying at the time. Yet despite all this chaos, people still loved the city, because Rome offered something almost nowhere else could: opportunity. If you wanted business, Rome had business. If you wanted work, Rome had work. If you wanted excitement, Rome had enough excitement for several lifetimes. Goods arrived from every corner of the empire. Ships brought grain from Egypt, spices from distant lands, marble from foreign quarries, silk from trade routes stretching farther than most people could imagine. Walk through the markets and you could hear different languages mixing together around you. Smells drifted from every direction: fresh bread, roasting meat, fish sauce, smoke, perfume, sweat, flowers, and occasionally smells nobody wanted to identify too closely. It was crowded, overwhelming, and alive in a way few places had ever been before. Rome was not simply a city. It was almost like a living creature breathing through its streets and swallowing people into its endless movement. And tomorrow, as the sun rises again, the noise will begin all over again. As the morning sun climbed higher above the rooftops of Rome, the city transformed from a restless giant into something far more intense, because now the streets were no longer simply busy, they were overflowing. Imagine standing near the center of the city and slowly turning in a circle. Everywhere you looked, movement. Merchants carrying baskets over their shoulders. Slaves rushing through crowds delivering messages and supplies. Children weaving through narrow spaces between adults. Street vendors shouting prices loud enough to challenge one another across entire roads. Somewhere nearby, metal hammers struck against metal as blacksmiths worked near open shops. Somewhere else, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the air from bakeries already crowded with customers. Ancient Rome did not gently wake up. It exploded into activity. And for many people, the first destination of the day was not work, not temples, and not government buildings. It was food. Because unlike modern homes with comfortable kitchens and refrigerators full of ingredients, many ordinary Romans lived in apartments where cooking was inconvenient or dangerous. Fires inside crowded buildings were a constant fear, and space was limited. So instead of preparing elaborate meals at home, countless Romans simply stepped outside and bought something to eat from nearby food stalls. The streets themselves became dining rooms. Small shops lined the roads with large clay containers set into stone counters. Inside were stews, vegetables, beans, olives, bread, cooked meats, and hot dishes prepared before sunrise. Workers stopped briefly while hurrying toward jobs. Travelers grabbed quick meals while moving through the city. Laborers leaned against walls, eating while talking loudly with friends. The entire city seemed to eat while standing, walking, negotiating, arguing, or rushing somewhere else. And if you stayed long enough near one of these places, you would begin noticing another Roman tradition appearing nearby. Conversation. Romans loved talking almost as much as they loved eating. Politics, business, rumors, sports, military campaigns, neighborhood gossip. Everyone had opinions and everyone seemed determined to share them. You might hear one man loudly explaining why a certain politician was an idiot, while another insisted Rome's problems came from poor leadership and bad grain prices. Nearby, two merchants argued over money while pretending they were not arguing. Somewhere else, three old men sat discussing gladiators with the seriousness of philosophers debating the meaning of life itself. Human beings, it turns out, have changed far less than we sometimes imagine. Then suddenly, a noise rises above everything else, shouting. Not angry shouting, excited shouting. People begin moving toward a nearby street, curiosity spreading faster than information. Heads turn. Shopkeepers step outside. Children run ahead, because something is coming. Around the corner appears a procession. Perhaps soldiers returning from somewhere beyond the city. Perhaps officials traveling with attendants. Perhaps entertainers performing for crowds. Rome loved spectacle. Almost anything capable of gathering attention immediately became public entertainment. Musicians played instruments. Animals were occasionally led through streets. Performers gathered crowds with tricks and stories. And ordinary life paused for a few moments while everyone watched. Then, just as quickly, movement resumed and Rome continued swallowing people into its endless flow once again. But beneath all the energy and noise, there was another side to the city most visitors rarely noticed at first. Because under the shouting merchants and busy roads and crowded markets, Rome had a problem hidden beneath its own success. City with nearly 1 million people creates an unbelievable amount of waste. Animals, smoke, food scraps, broken pottery, sewage, garbage, and thousands upon thousands of people living very close together meant keeping the city clean was almost impossible. And workers constantly tried clearing streets. Water systems carried away waste. Sewers stretched beneath parts of the city. Roman engineering was remarkable. But even remarkable engineering has limits when an enormous population decides to exist all at once. The smell alone probably changed from street to street. Fresh bread in one area, flowers and perfume in another, fish markets somewhere nearby, less pleasant things somewhere else entirely. Visitors arriving in Rome likely imagined marble and greatness. What they discovered instead was marble and greatness mixed together with humanity in all of its loud, messy, crowded reality. Because Rome was not built only by emperors and generals. Rome was built every day by bakers opening shops before sunrise, laborers carrying stones, merchants selling food, workers shouting across markets, and ordinary people trying to survive another day inside the largest city most of the world had ever seen. And by midday, with heat beginning to rise from stone roads and sunlight pouring between buildings, the city was only becoming louder. By midday, the heat had settled over Rome like a heavy blanket, pressing down onto rooftops, stone roads, crowded markets, and every person moving through the city. The sun reflected off pale walls and marble buildings until certain streets almost seemed to glow. The city that had felt energetic during the morning now felt hotter, louder, and somehow even more alive. Stone absorbed warmth and slowly released it back into the air, creating streets that trapped heat between tightly packed buildings. Dust rose beneath thousands of feet. Donkeys pulled overloaded carts through roads barely wide enough to fit them. Merchants wiped sweat from their faces while still shouting prices to passing crowds, because in Rome, work rarely paused, simply because the weather became uncomfortable. If anything, the city seemed to grow stronger under chaos. Near the larger markets, movement became almost impossible. Imagine standing in the middle of a crowd where every person has somewhere important to be and nobody has any intention of slowing down. Sellers displayed baskets filled with fruit, jars of oil, fish packed with salt, cloth from distant regions, spices carried across long trade routes, and objects so strange-looking that travelers sometimes stopped just to stare at them. Voices overlapped from every direction until individual conversations disappeared into a constant wave of sound. Somewhere a merchant promised impossible quality. Nearby, another insisted his prices were the lowest in Rome, even while customers accused him of robbery. Arguments started and ended within minutes. Deals were made with handshakes and suspicion. Children ran between adults carrying messages while trying not to disappear inside the sea of moving bodies around them. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about Rome was not the buildings or the crowds or even the noise. It was the fact that people from almost every corner of the known world eventually found themselves standing in the same streets. Rome had stretched its reach across enormous distances, and its capital reflected that reality. Walk through the city long enough and you might hear languages from distant provinces blending together around you. Traders from Africa discussing prices with merchants from Greece. Soldiers returning from frontiers far away from home. Travelers bringing stories from lands many citizens would never see. Exotic animals occasionally appeared in markets or public displays, creating crowds of curious spectators gathering around creatures they had only heard described before. For ordinary Romans, the city itself became a window into the wider world. You could remain in one place and still feel as though the entire empire had come to visit you. Yet beneath all the movement and excitement, another reality waited quietly in the background, because not everyone in Rome experienced the city in the same way. Wealth and poverty often existed only streets apart. One road might lead toward elegant homes, belonging to wealthy families with spacious rooms, decorated walls, private gardens, and fountains softly pouring water into shaded courtyards. Then, a few minutes later, another road might carry you into crowded neighborhoods, filled with narrow apartments where entire families shared tiny spaces above noisy streets below. The contrast must have felt almost unreal. Some people spent afternoons discussing politics while relaxing beside gardens. Others spent those same hours carrying heavy goods through heat and dust simply to earn enough money for another meal. Rome displayed greatness everywhere, but it also displayed inequality everywhere. And then, as afternoon slowly began moving toward evening, another shift started taking place. Shadows stretched farther across roads. Shopkeepers began counting coins and organizing goods. Workers started moving toward home. The intense energy of midday slowly transformed into something different. Not quieter, not yet, but different. Because everyone knew the city still had one more version of itself waiting to appear. Rome after sunset was a world entirely of its own, and many citizens understood something important. During daylight, Rome belonged to crowds and commerce. But after dark, Rome belonged to uncertainty. As evening slowly settled across Rome, the city seemed to exhale after carrying the weight of an entire day upon its shoulders. Sunlight that had once burned brightly across rooftops now softened into long golden beams, stretching between buildings and across crowded streets. The noise of the market slowly began changing shape. Merchants packed away goods that had been displayed since sunrise. Wooden shutters folded closed over shop entrances. Bakers brushed flour from their hands after long hours beside hot ovens. Laborers moved through the streets carrying the exhaustion of the day with them. Somewhere in the distance, temple bells echoed faintly while smoke rose into the darkening sky from hundreds and hundreds of cooking fires. Rome was preparing for night. But unlike many cities where darkness signals rest, Rome simply transformed into another version of itself. The crowds became smaller, yet somehow the city felt larger. Shadows stretched farther between narrow buildings. Oil lamps flickered beside doorways and along busier roads, creating small islands of light surrounded by deep darkness. Faces briefly appeared beneath the glow of flames and then disappeared again into the shadows beyond them. Footsteps echoed differently now. During the day they vanished beneath noise and crowds, but at night every sound seemed sharper, more noticeable. A distant laugh carried through empty streets. A cartwheel rattled somewhere beyond sight. A dog barked in an unseen courtyard. Somewhere a group of men argued loudly before suddenly becoming silent. The city almost felt alive in a different way, as if Rome itself had changed personalities after sunset. Taverns became brighter while streets became darker. Warm light spilled from open doors where voices, laughter, and music drifted outward into the night air. Inside, workers and travelers sat together drinking wine after long days. Dice rolled across tables. Stories grew more dramatic with every cup emptied. Men who had spent the morning carrying stones or selling vegetables suddenly became warriors and heroes in their own stories by evening. Victories became larger. Problems became smaller. And every listener somehow knew that at least half of what they were hearing probably never happened at all. But nobody seemed particularly concerned about accuracy. Sometimes the purpose of stories is not truth. Sometimes the purpose is simply companionship. Outside the taverns, however, the city became more uncertain. Wealthier citizens rarely traveled alone at night if they could avoid it. Darkness created opportunities. Shadows hid intentions. The same roads crowded with merchants during daylight now carried smaller groups of people moving quickly toward homes before the city grew even darker. Because Rome after dark had its own rules, and experienced citizens understood them well. Walk carefully. Stay aware of your surroundings. Avoid unnecessary attention. And if possible, avoid wandering through unfamiliar districts entirely. Yet despite all of this, despite the danger, despite the noise, despite the crowded streets and uncertainty, people continued arriving in Rome every year. Thousands upon thousands of them. Some came searching for work. Others came searching for opportunity. Some arrived carrying dreams large enough to fill entire futures, because Rome possessed something powerful that stretched far beyond marble buildings or military victories. Rome possessed gravity, not physical gravity, but the kind that pulls people toward places where they believe life might become something larger than it was before. For a farmer from a distant province, Rome represented possibility. For a merchant, it represented wealth. For a soldier, it represented glory. For ordinary people, it represented hope mixed together with risk. And perhaps that is why Rome became so unforgettable. Because beneath all the statues and monuments and stories of emperors, Rome was ultimately a city of human beings. Real people waking before sunrise, rushing through crowded streets, buying meals from food stalls, arguing with neighbors, laughing with friends, working long days, worrying about tomorrow, and dreaming about better futures. The marble temples survived in history books. The triumphal arches survived in ruins. The names of emperors survived in records. But millions,